A young woman vanished walking home from her late shift on a quiet street in a town where nothing like that had ever happened. By the third day, her photo was taped to every window on Main Street. By the second week, the search had covered 11 square miles of forest and farmland. By the third month, almost everyone had quietly stopped looking. But 9 years later, her body was found less than 400 yards from where the original search teams had stood, calling her name into the trees. And the man who found it had walked that exact search line himself in the same boots with the same flashlight all those years ago. This is Hollow Creek, Oregon, October 2014. Mara Lindfist was 22, soft-spoken, the kind of person who remembered everyone's order at the diner without writing it down. She'd grown up in Hollow Creek, left for 2 years to study nursing in Eugene, and come back when her mother got sick, picking up shifts at the Roadhouse Diner on Route 9 to help with bills. She kept a small collection of secondhand paperback mysteries on her nightstand, the kind with cracked spines from thrift store shelves, and told Casey once, half joking, that she liked them because the worst thing in them always got solved by the end. She wasn't the type to disappear. Her roommate, Casey Voss, said later that Mara was almost annoyingly predictable. Same walk home every night, same 15-minute route down Birch Street past the lumberyard. Same text to Casey when she left work. On my way every single night, like clockwork, for the 8 months she'd worked there. Wayne Castellano, by most accounts, was exactly the kind of man a small town doesn't think twice about. 38 years old, divorced young with no children, he'd inherited his father's modest property on the edge of town, along with a reputation for being reliable, fair-priced and easy to forget the moment a job was finished. He fixed fences, mowed lawns, occasionally helped the diner with plumbing issues, and was, in the words of one longtime customer, the kind of guy you'd hand your house key to without thinking about it twice. He'd known Mara the way a town that size makes everyone know everyone, in passing, in nods, in small favors. October 9th, 2014, a Thursday, unseasonably warm for that time of year, the kind of dry heat that made the pine needles crunch underfoot. Mara clocked out of the Roadhouse Diner at 9:43 p.m. Surveillance footage from the gas station 2 blocks down. The last camera on her route showed her at 9:51 p.m. buying a bottle of orange soda and a pack of gum, laughing at something the cashier said. Tucking her apron into her bag, she sent the text to Casey at 9:52 p.m., on my way. Then she turned left onto Birch Street, toward the lumber yard, toward home. That was the last time anyone saw her walking under her own power. Casey didn't think much of it when the reply never came. Mara sometimes stopped at her mother's place on the way home, sat with her for a while, lost track of time. It wasn't until 11:30 p.m., when Casey woke up to use the bathroom and saw Mara's bed still made, that something in her chest went cold. She called Mara's mother first. No, Mara hadn't stopped by. She called Mara's phone. It rang twice, then went straight to voicemail. By 1 a.m., Casey was standing in the Hollow Creek Sheriff's Office parking lot in her pajamas, filing a missing persons report with a deputy who kept asking if Mara had a boyfriend she might be staying with, as if that question would make the feeling in Casey's chest go away. The search began at first light. Sheriff's deputies, volunteer fire crews, and within hours, more than 60 members of the community walked Birch Street end to end, fanning out into the wooded lots behind the lumber yard, into the dry creek bed that gave the town its name. Mara's phone was pinged once more at 9:58 p.m. The night she disappeared, 6 minutes after her last text, from a tower less than half a mile from where she'd been walking. After that, nothing. No further pings, no further activity, no charges on her debit card, no calls. It was as if she had taken 6 minutes to walk somewhere and then simply stopped existing. Detective Raymond Ortiz, who would spend the next 9 years of his career returning to this case, said in an early press briefing that the lack of evidence was itself the most troubling part. Normally these things leave a trail. A car that didn't start right, a fight with someone, a text she sent that she shouldn't have. We had none of that. We had a girl who said goodnight and then the world just closed around her. Cadaver dogs were brought in on day 4. They alerted twice near the creek bed, both times to nothing. Both times explained away as old deer carcasses or simple confusion in the brush. Search teams covered the 11 square miles around Hollow Creek twice over, then a third time, widening the radius each week as hope thinned but refused to disappear entirely. Search coordinator Linda Hask, a retired Forest Service ranger who organized the volunteer grid sweeps, said the terrain itself worked against them from the start. People think a search is about how many bodies you put on the ground. It's about sight lines. Half that county is blackberry bramble thick enough to hide a parked car 6 feet off a trail. We walked past things every single day that we just couldn't see. On day 11, a delivery driver reported seeing a dark-colored pickup truck idling without its headlights on near the lumber yard gate sometime after 10 o'clock the night Mara disappeared, parked at an angle that didn't match any of the yard's regular trucks. He couldn't describe the driver. He couldn't even fully describe the truck beyond its color and the fact that it pulled away slowly, almost carefully, rather than speeding off. Deputies canvassed every registered pickup within a 5-mile radius. 11 trucks matched the general description. All 11 were cleared within the week. One of the volunteers who showed up every single day for the first 3 weeks was Castellano himself. He helped coordinate one of the search grids near the old grain silo. He printed flyers at the public library and handed them out at the gas station, the same gas station where the last footage of Mara existed. Neighbors remembered him as helpful, a little awkward, the kind of man who didn't say much but always showed up when something needed fixing. By the second week, the search had grown organized but increasingly hollow, the energy of the first days curdling into something heavier. A local hiker reported a strange smell near an old well on an abandoned property a mile outside town. Search teams investigated and found nothing but stagnant water and rusted machinery. A trucker called in a tip about a woman matching Mara's description seen at a rest stop 200 miles south. It went nowhere. The woman in question located and cleared within a day. Each lead opened a small window of hope and then closed it a little harder than before. By the 3rd month, official search efforts were formally scaled back. Detective Ortiz told the local paper that the case remained open, that they would never stop looking, language that families of the missing learn over time to recognize as a kind of quiet surrender. Privately, Ortiz kept Mara's case file on the corner of his desk for years, long after it had been boxed and archived alongside the department's other unsolved cases. Colleagues remembered him pulling it out on slow night shifts, rereading the same witness statements, the same gas station footage timestamps, looking for something he might have missed the first dozen times through. Some cases just sit in you, he said years later after the arrest. You carry them around whether you want to or not. I used to drive past that lumber yard on my way home and slow down without meaning to every single time for almost a decade. On the first anniversary of her disappearance, the local paper ran a single-column update 3 paragraphs tucked behind the high school football recap. By the second anniversary, there was no update at all, just a candlelight vigil organized by Mara's mother and attended by fewer than 20 people, the same 20 who showed up every October without being asked. Years passed the way they do in towns like Hollow Creek, slowly and then suddenly. Casey moved away. Mara's mother kept a missing flyer taped inside her kitchen window for so long that the sun bleached it nearly blank. The lumber yard expanded its lot. The gas station changed owners twice. Around the 5-year mark, a local true crime enthusiast started a small social media page dedicated to the case, posting maps and timelines and asking followers to comb through old satellite imagery for anything searchers might have missed. The page generated a brief spike of attention, a tip line flooded with theories, most involving a stretch of abandoned mining tunnels 20 miles outside town that had nothing to do with the case at all. Sheriff's deputies spent the better part of a week clearing those tunnels at the county's expense before quietly closing that lead too. Wayne Castellano kept doing odd jobs, kept to himself, occasionally mentioned in passing how strange it still felt that nobody had ever found her, how he sometimes thought about it while mowing lawns near where the search lines had been. People nodded along. It was the kind of thing everyone in Hollow Creek thought about, in flashes, usually late at night, usually without saying so out loud. In September of 2023, nearly 9 years after Mara disappeared, the county began a long-delayed drainage project to widen a culvert beneath an access road on the far edge of town, an area that had been part of the original search radius but was by then mostly forgotten, overgrown with blackberry bramble and young alder trees. A backhoe operator named Pete Suarez was clearing brush along the culvert's edge when his bucket caught on something that didn't give the way roots or rock usually did. He climbed down to clear it by hand, expecting maybe an old tire, a length of buried fencing, the kind of debris that turns up in every drainage job in a town like this. The first thing he saw was pale and folded at an angle that looked, for a moment, almost peaceful, like fabric settling after a fall. He told investigators later he actually reached out and touched it before his mind caught up with what his hand was telling him. Construction stopped within minutes. The county medical examiner's office was on site by early afternoon, and within hours, deputies had cordoned off a quarter-mile of the access road. The remains were skeletal, consistent with someone who had been deceased for an extended period, recovered along with a corroded bracelet that Mara's mother would later identify through tears as one she'd given her daughter for her 21st birthday. Dental records confirmed it within the week. After 9 years, Mara Lindqvist had been found, less than 400 yards from the spot where searchers had once stood calling her name into the same trees that had, it turned out, been hiding nothing at all back then. That should have been the end of the story. It wasn't. Forensic anthropologist Dr. Lena Whitfield, brought in to assess the remains, noticed something almost immediately that didn't sit right with the timeline. Soil stratification around the burial site, the depth and composition of sediment layered above and around the remains suggested the body had only been in that specific location for somewhere between 2 and 3 years, not 9. The decomposition pattern was consistent with a body that had spent its first 6 or 7 years somewhere else entirely, somewhere with different soil chemistry, different moisture exposure, before being moved. The ground doesn't lie the way people do, Dr. Whitfield said in her report. Once you've worked with enough recovered remains, you learn to read disturbance like a second language. This wasn't a burial that happened once. This was a burial that happened twice. For about a week, Hollow Creek experienced something it hadn't felt in 9 years, a strange, exhausted kind of relief. The local paper ran a front-page story with a headline, "Mara Comes Home," and for a handful of days the town allowed itself to believe the worst part was simply that she had been gone, that the case, however tragic, was finally and fully closed. Mara's mother told a neighbor she finally felt like she could breathe normally for the first time since 2014. That sense of closure lasted exactly as long as it took Dr. Whitfield to finish her preliminary report. That single finding reopened the entire case in a way 9 years of cold leads never had. If Mara had been somewhere else first, then someone had gone back. Soil chemistry wasn't the only marker. Dr. Whitfield's team also noted inconsistencies in insect activity patterns typically used to estimate time since death, evidence that decomposition had progressed in stages inconsistent with a single undisturbed burial, what she described in her report as a timeline interrupted and restarted. Someone had dug Mara up years after the initial search had ended, years after the town had moved on, and relocated her to a culvert on the edge of an access road that was about to be excavated for the first time in decades. Detective Ortiz, by then nearing retirement, took the case back personally. "Whoever did this didn't panic once," he said. "They panicked twice, years apart. That tells you something. That tells you this person never stopped watching this case from the inside." Investigators began cross-referencing property records, construction permits, and anything that might explain why someone would need to move a body, and the specific window forensic analysis pointed to sometime between 2021 and 2022. The work took weeks, sorting through county deed transfers, soil survey filings, and equipment rental records for half the properties bordering the original search radius. They found it almost immediately once they knew where to look. Wayne Castellano had sold a small parcel of land that year, a wooded lot he'd inherited from his father on the edge of town, to a developer planning a small subdivision. Soil surveys and clearing work on that parcel had begun in the spring of 2021. A junior analyst on the case, cross-checking equipment rental logs against the property sale date almost as an afterthought, noticed that Castellano had rented a portable generator and a set of floodlights from the local hardware store for 3 consecutive nights in October of that year, an unusual rental for a man who, by his own account, had no active jobs requiring outdoor lighting that week. Cadaver dogs, brought back to the site nearly a decade after the original search, alerted within minutes near an old depression in the earth, close to where Castellano's childhood home had once stood, long since demolished. Soil and chemical residue testing confirmed it. That depression had held a body once. It didn't anymore. Wayne Castellano was brought in for questioning on a Tuesday morning in late October 2023, almost exactly 9 years to the week after Mara disappeared. Deputies arrived just after sunrise, 3 vehicles parking quietly along the gravel shoulder of his road so as not to alert him before they reached the door. He answered the door himself in work clothes, a coffee mug still in his hand. Steam still rising off it in the cold morning air, and according to the deputies present, he didn't ask why they were there. He set the mug down on the porch railing, where it sat untouched for the rest of the morning, and said quietly, "I always figured this day would come eventually." He was cuffed without incident and transported to the county sheriff's office, where he was placed in an interrogation room separate from the one where investigators laid out, piece by piece, what 9 years of silence and 2 years of digging had finally assembled against him. For the first several hours, Castellano said almost nothing. Investigators later described him as unnervingly calm, answering questions about his work schedule and his property sale in flat, measured sentences, as though the interview were about a permit application rather than a body. Then, late into the second day, faced with the soil analysis, the cadaver dog alerts on his former property, and cell tower data placing his phone near the access road culvert during 3 separate overnight windows in the fall of 2021, something in him shifted. Detective Ortiz, who sat across from him for most of both sessions, said Castellano's voice dropped almost to a whisper when he finally began to talk, as though he were telling the story to himself for the first time rather than to the room. According to his confession, he had approached Mara that night near the lumber yard, ostensibly to offer her a ride home, something he had done a handful of times before during odd jobs around the diner. When she declined and continued walking, he said an argument followed, one he claimed escalated faster than he intended, ending with her death in the wooded lot behind his family's old property, a property he knew intimately, having grown up on it. He buried her there that same night, in the dark, using tools from his own truck. I remember telling myself it would just be for a little while, he said at one point, according to the interview transcript later entered into evidence. I don't know what I thought that meant. A little while turned into years. The motive investigators eventually pieced together was almost insultingly small for what it had cost. Castellano told detectives he had asked Mara out twice over the prior year, both times turned down gently but firmly, and that something about the second rejection, delivered with a polite laugh, he said, he never stopped hearing, had festered in him in a way he couldn't fully explain even to himself. It wasn't supposed to happen like that, he told investigators, a phrase the lead prosecutor would later read aloud to the jury twice, slowly, letting the silence afterwards speak for itself. He volunteered for the search efforts in the following weeks, he admitted, partly out of guilt and partly, he said, because staying involved felt safer than disappearing from view entirely. He printed flyers with her face on them. He walked search grids less than a quarter mile from where he'd buried her. He told detectives he sometimes had to stop walking and catch his breath, and that the other volunteers assumed it was grief. The second burial, the one that broke the case open 9 years later, happened because of the land sale. When the developer's soil survey crew scheduled clearing work for the spring of 2021, Castellano realized the depression behind his old family home, a spot he had walked past thousands of times in the years since, sat directly in the path of planned excavation. Over 3 nights that October, alone, using a flashlight and the same kind of tools he'd used the first time, he dug up what remained of Mara Lindvist and drove her, in the bed of his own truck, to the culvert on the access road, a site he knew was scheduled for drainage work eventually, but, he believed, not for years. He miscalculated by 2 years. I thought I had more time, he told investigators. The same sentence repeated in slightly different forms throughout his confession, as though time itself were the only thing he had ever truly been negotiating with. Wayne Castellano was charged with murder and 2 counts of evidence tampering related to both burials. His defense attorney argued throughout the trial that the killing itself had not been premeditated, that the evidence supported a sudden and unplanned act of violence rather than a calculated murder, a distinction that mattered legally, even if it changed little about how the town would remember him. The argument gained little traction with the jury once the second burial was introduced as evidence, the prosecution returning again and again to the same point. Whatever happened in that first terrible hour behind the lumber yard, everything that came after, the years of silence, the volunteer shifts, The flyers, the second burial executed calmly under floodlights he'd rented specifically for. The task had been a choice made over and over for nearly a decade. The trial, held in the spring of 2024, drew the largest crowds Hollow Creek's small county courthouse had seen in decades. Mara's mother attended every day, seated in the front row, the bleached missing flyer from her kitchen window framed and resting on her lap throughout the proceedings. Detective Ortiz testified for nearly 4 hours. Dr. Whitfield's soil analysis was presented to the jury in painstaking detail. 2 burial sites, 2 separate chemical signatures, 2 acts of digging separated by 7 years, and the same pair of hands. Casey Voss took the stand briefly, describing the flyer Castellano had handed her at the gas station less than a week into the search, her voice breaking only once when the prosecutor asked her to describe his expression as he handed it over. "He looked sad," she said. I believed it. In her closing statement, the lead prosecutor told the jury that the most disturbing evidence in the entire case wasn't the soil or the cell tower data or even the confession itself, but the 9 years in between, the volunteer shifts, the flyers, the small kindnesses extended to a grieving town by the one person who had never stopped knowing exactly where the grief should have been pointed. The jury deliberated for just under 6 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. Before sentencing, Mara's mother was given the opportunity to address the court directly. She stood holding the framed flyer and read from a single index card she had carried in her purse since the day of the discovery. "You handed me a flyer with my own daughter's face on it," she said, looking at Castellano for the first and only time during the entire trial. "I thanked you for it. I want you to think about that every day for the rest of your life, the way I have to think about the 9 years I spent thanking the wrong people." Castellano did not look up. Castellano was sentenced to life in prison with a possibility of parole after 30 years. A number that drew an audible sound from the gallery, somewhere between a sob and a laugh, that no one present could quite identify afterward. Outside the courthouse, Mara's mother spoke briefly to the small crowd of reporters who'd gathered. "Everyone kept telling me she was found," she said, "but she wasn't found. She was moved twice by the only person in this town who knew exactly where to look the whole time. We didn't find her. He just ran out of time to hide her again." She declined further questions and walked back to her car alone, still holding the framed flyer against her chest. For the town of Hollow Creek, the case left behind a particular kind of unease that didn't fade the way grief usually does. The wooded lot behind Castellano's childhood home was sold off again within the year, the new owners reportedly unaware of its history until neighbors quietly informed them. The access road culvert where Mara was finally recovered now has a small weathered cross near the drainage grate, placed there without ceremony sometime in late 2023. No name on it, just a date. The high school Mara never finished her nursing degree, eventually established a small scholarship in her name for students pursuing health care, funded in part by donations from people in town who said, almost identically, that they just wanted something good to come out of all of it, even something small. Casey Voss, Mara's old roommate, gave a single interview 18 months after the trial. When asked what she remembered most, she didn't talk about the search, or the trial, or the years of silence. "I remember that he handed me a flyer once," she said, "at the gas station. He looked right at me and said he hoped we found her soon. I think about that more than almost anything else from those 9 years. The case is still referenced in regional law enforcement training as an example of how forensic soil analysis can expose a second crime hiding inside what looks, on the surface, like the resolution of a first one. Dr. Whitfield has since presented the case at 2 forensic anthropology conferences, using it as a teaching example of how stratification analysis can reveal a burial's true history even after a body has been moved. Photographs of the 2 distinct soil profiles displayed side by side on a projector screen for rooms full of students who, by her account, always go quiet at the same point in the slideshow. Detective Ortiz, in his final statement before retiring later that year, put the case more simply than any report ever could. She wasn't lost, he said. She was kept. The whole time by someone who never stopped pretending to look for her alongside the rest of us. That line has since been quoted at 2 separate criminal justice conferences, usually without context, usually followed by a long pause before the next speaker continues. Mara Lindvist was 22 years old. She is buried now, finally and completely, in the same cemetery as her mother, who passed away just under a year after the trial concluded, having lived just long enough to see the case closed. In the months between the discovery and the verdict, the case drew attention far beyond Hollow Creek, picked up by several true crime podcasts and a handful of national outlets drawn specifically to the detail that had unsettled investigators most, that the man who buried her had also been one of the people who searched for her. Mara's mother gave only one interview during that period, telling a regional reporter that she didn't care about the attention, only that it meant more people now understood why she'd never taken the flyer out of her kitchen window, not once in 9 years. I wasn't being stubborn, she said. Some part of me must have known we weren't done yet. If there is a single detail from this story that refuses to settle, it might be this. For 9 years, the ground beneath Hollow Creek held a secret that wasn't supposed to move. And then, for 2 of those years, it held a different one in a different place, because someone decided it had to. If you made it to the end, thank you for staying. This story is built from public investigative procedure, forensic methodology, and courtroom testimony patterns documented in real, cold case recoveries, reconstructed here as a composite case. Cases like this exist far more often than people realize, where the person standing in the search line, holding a flashlight, handing out flyers, already knows exactly where to stop looking and exactly where not to. What part of this stayed with you the longest? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. And if these are the kinds of cases that follow you out of the room, subscribe, because there are more of them still buried, waiting for someone to ask the ground the right question.